Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The False Narratives of Self-Help Gurus and Cult Leaders, Tilting at Windmills and Green Lights. In life, a man commits himself, draws his own portrait, and there is nothing but that portrait. No doubt this thought may seem comfortless to one who has not made a success of his life. Jean-Paul Sartre, Existentialism and Humanism. Well, hi everybody, and you can immediately see from my choice of this quote why I never became a self-help guru or motivational speaker, more like demotivational speaker. But this sums up for me in a very succinct way the opposition I'll be presenting to you between the self-help mentality that it's in its most extreme form morphs from expensive self-help gurus selling you expensive courses to the very extreme end, cultish type movements and all the anguish that comes with those. So in opposition to those, I'm going to be, as the channel tends to do, proposing that art, literature and visual art have qualities that actually make the need for self-help redundant. And arguably self-help movements and self-help gurus have become so popular because art, literature and all the things I bang on about all the time have increasingly been emptied out from our society. And I'll be using a mix of Kierkegaard and Sartre on the philosophical front and the two specific literary illustrations of Don Quixote by Cervantes and The Great Gatsby. So we'll see if I convince you of all this, and let's get into it. So that square-jawed piece of beefcake, Tony Robbins, I'm sure you'll recognise him. And then this is Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, existential philosopher, and the more sharp-witted amongst you will have realised his head has been morphed onto an anachronistically modern suit. So I'm proposing this is what Kierkegaard would have looked like if he'd have become a motivational self-help guru. And then, God bless him, Jean-Paul Sartre. And then, as I said, I'll be using Don Quixote as an illustration, a literary illustration. Talking about illustrations, this is from 1955, I think. Picasso did this. I just think it's a brilliant encapsulation of, or just image of, Don Quixote with his mate Sancho Panza. And then I'll be looking at The Great Gatsby, and I must admit, it's more about me than I'm not criticising the literature. I've never really been into modern American or relatively modern American literature. I've found it, it just doesn't really speak to me. But The Great Gatsby, I think there are elements of The Great Gatsby and the symbolism within it that really lend themselves to some of the themes I want to talk about today. And I'm guessing, I know I've got quite a few North American viewers, and I'm guessing in high school and stuff, there's a strong likelihood you would have come across The Great Gatsby. And it'll be interesting in the comments to find out what your perspectives are upon my interpretation of some of the symbolism within it and what maybe you were taught in high school. So the argument, the self-help industry, and I understand I'm giving broad brushstrokes. I'm just giving, I hope it's not a caricature. So again, in the comments, if you think I've misrepresented the self-help movement, obviously I'm using just a very broad term. But I'd argue one of the key aspects would be this idea in the industry as a whole that life is a project to be successfully managed, and the management tends to occur with certain patented systems that they have devised and they will sell to you for quite a lot of money if you go on X amount of courses and attend X amount of seminars and buy all the supporting literature or online modules or whatever. And the purpose of all this is so you can be who you want to be. Now, I've never, ever, it's never made sense to me that the likelihood that any commercial minded organization would have the key or the secret to human potential. Just the likelihood, I'd call me cynical, but the fact that there's a hunger for it and these people make an awful lot of money tells you that something is missing in our society. And you'd be surprised to hear, because this is the theme of the whole channel, I would always argue that, nature abhors a vacuum, and the self-help gurus, and at the most extreme end, the cult leaders, are feeding on the emptiness of modern society because the role of literature, great art, has basically been evacuated. It's missing. It's a much less important part of our lives, and people are desperate for meaning, so they fill it with these, and I don't mean to dismiss all of them, but it does strike me there's a little bit of snake oil salesmanship going on, to put it politely. So what do I propose in opposition to this? Well, rather than life being a project to be managed, I'm suggesting life is a personal artwork. And again, why I could never be a motivational speaker. Life is a personal artwork of which the only certainty is that it will fail. Maybe I'm just speaking from personal experience. But I think the motto would be, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. So Samuel Beckett's Worst Would Ho. And I just think it's a brilliant depiction. And I think in a previous video I've quoted a decent sized segment of that. And in a future video I want to look at in much more detail the purportedly negative, tragic aspects of lots of traditional narratives, but actually how they help orientate us psychologically in a much more healthy way. It's all about this argument that we've lost, from Nietzsche, especially the idea of the birth of tragedy, and his argument is because we've lost touch with the ancient Greek notion of tragedy, that has been a loss to society. And this idea that Beckett also encapsulates, the recognition of failure, the recognition that our lives are constrained by existential parameters. We're going to die. There is limited control we have over our lives. This stands in almost exact opposition to the mantra, be who you want to be. We will give you the keys to unlocking your potential. Release your inner giant, and all these type of cliched phrases. Literature, fairy tales, all these things I'm developing more and more videos on are designed in the exact opposite way, that they're actually helping you orientate yourself to the notion that we have limited control in our lives. But as I explored with the Albert Camus video, the idea that within those limitations you can still, despite how absurd existence seems, you can still maintain your sense of autonomy and freedom. So it's a lot of art and literature. It's counterintuitive. It may seem not particularly life-affirming, but as we go along, I hope I'll convince you that actually it doesn't hide anything, and ultimately it is more realistic, despite often coming in the form of fiction, and more life-affirming than these purportedly more practical, more pragmatic, and commercially accessible self-help movements, and eventually, like I say, at the extreme end, cults. So we'll see how much I can convince you. But talking about cults, This is Keith Raniere from Nexium, and he received 120 years in prison for his misdeeds. And there's a really fascinating documentary series called The Vow, which I recommend you check out. And in Series 1, Episode 4, Keith Raniere, the leader of the cult, he's in a gymnasium because he had this weird thing where he'd meet with followers and they'd play volleyball all the time, really late into the night. But Alison Mack was an actress and she was introduced to him. And so he's basically grooming her for membership of the cult. And this is these verbatim from the documentary. This is the dialogue they had, which I think is very illustrative of some of the key themes I wanted to look at. So Keith Raniere asks Alison Mack why art is so important to her. She says that it's because so much of who she is wrapped up in it. So he says, Alison Mack says, something happens to me that's blissful, joyful. And Keith Raniere says, we can practice this. So immediately, the idea that some deep inner emotion or sense of the sublime or aesthetic awareness, he reduces it to we can practice this. It's something he wants to control. And that's one of the main themes I want to ask you to think about, is the way in which the inner part, this is what self-help movements and cults have in common, I'd propose, is that they claim they can help you control your inner self. And I would suggest there's an immediate paradox right from the get-go. They have the secret for you to access your own inner self. And this runs directly counter to what I would suggest is the strength of art and literature. They help you access your inner self in relation to the outer world. And it's not done through some secret code or some secret key that only an organization that requires a lot of payment can provide for you. But this is Keith Raniere as he proceeds. So I'm calling it the art of interior gaslighting. You're being gaslit over control of your inner sensibilities. So this is Keith Raniere speaking. The feeling can be generated from within, and to think that you can only get it from without is a form of self-condemnation. What if artistic endeavours were really bogus? I think you're projecting there, Keith. What if art is just an excuse for those who couldn't do? The most excitement you've ever felt is yours to have all the time, independent of art. The bad news is you sort of have to divorce yourself from the thought that it comes from the art. If you feel that art is necessary for that, that's almost a self-condemnation. So this is the gaslighting part. Keith Raniere, is laying claim to your inner feelings and judging you for having them and proposing that he can give you these feelings all the time. Now, why I've said I think cults are an extreme form, there is at a much milder level. This is what self-help gurus also claim. Maybe not necessarily in these specific terms, but they will basically say they can help you gain control of everything that's wrong in your life. But in this particular case, Keith Raniere, he's gone the extra mile. If you feel that art is necessary for that, that's almost a self-condemnation. He's turning the one thing in Alison Mack's life that gives her meaning into a guilt trip. So that's why I'm suggesting it's a gaslighting. But all this relates to the concept of interiority, how we perceive ourselves and by extension relate to the outside world. And it's so in direct contrast to this type of anti-artistic sentiment, I'm proposing we start with the novel Don Quixote. Now, why pick Don Quixote? One reason is that it's arguably the first modern novel. So scholars can disagree, what was the first genuinely modern novel. But I would probably agree it was Don Quixote. And interestingly, it was written in two parts. The first 1605, the second 1615. And I don't have time in this particular video. If there's any enthusiasm in the comments, I could do a whole video on Don Quixote. Because just talking about Cervantes, the author alone, what a fascinating life he had. Held prisoner, I think, for about 5 years. Injured his arm at the Battle of Lepanto. And then, rather humorously, for the purposes of Don Quixote, the book, he basically published part 2 in 1615 because someone produced a spurious rip-off copy of the story. What would you call it now? A unsanctioned sequel to the original. So the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. So in 1615, Cervantes basically published part 2 as a riposte to this false part 2 that a competing anonymous author had produced. But all in all, it's an exceptional novel for the way there are wheels within wheels, there are narratives within narratives, there's imaginary scenarios within imaginary scenarios. I've talked in previous videos about the concept of the labyrinth, and the narrative structure of Don Quixote is labyrinthine. And in the beginning of part 2, it's quite funny because Cervantes comments upon the fact there's been an unsanctioned sequel written by somebody else within the novel Don Quixote. So he's referring to the real false sequel in the actual part 2 of the real novel that has been completely ripped off by the fake Don Quixote, even though the novel Don Quixote is about an imaginary character who furthermore has an overactive imagination. So the narrative complexity, given this was written in 1605 and then 1615, I just think is amazing. And that's just, yes, it was 1955 was the Picasso painting. Now, one of the reasons I chose Don Quixote, apart from it is the original, arguably modern novel about how we as individual people generate our imagination and interact with the outside world. But there was also this, it's an incredibly short, I call it a short story, it's basically a paragraph. But Franz Kafka, who in a few videos' time I'll be doing a presentation on the Metamorphosis. But he wrote this very, very short story about the truth about Sancho Panza. And it's cited by this Emmanuel Berman, who was a psychoanalyst who was training students. And he gave what I'm about to show you to students without telling them who'd written it and without giving them the title. Sorry, the title was there, but he didn't tell them who wrote it. And he asked them to do an analysis of it. So it'd be interesting what you make of it, but this is the actual full story written by Kafka. And like I say, he didn't tell the students it was Kafka. Without making any boast of it, Sancho Panza succeeded in the course of years by devouring a great number of romances of chivalry and adventure in the evening and night hours. In so diverting him from his demon, whom he later called Don Quixote, that his demon thereupon set out in perfect freedom on the maddest exploits, which, however, for the lack of a preordained object, which should have been Sancho Panza himself, harmed nobody. A free man, Sancho Panza philosophically followed Don Quixote on his crusades, perhaps out of a sense of responsibility, and had of them a great and edifying entertainment to the end of his days. So there's various things to be said, and I'll give you what Berman's response to this was. But ultimately, as I'll explain, I think there are various levels to Kafka's engagement with the story of Cervantes. And as I described in the plot of Don Quixote, there's stories within stories, wheels within wheels, narrations within narrations. And in this short story, you have a great short story writer, Franz Kafka, reversing the normal characterizations of Sancho Panza and Don Quixote. And in only a paragraph, he just introduces some really fascinating ideas. But what Berman was not surprised by, what he noticed was when he gave this to his students to analyze, their responses were trying to be as objective and as scientific as possible. And I think the little experiment that he did is important and interesting, because what it shows you is people trying to be psychologically insightful using psychoanalysis, psychology. They completely missed the very unique quality of the literature in front of them, and its subtlety and its psychological acuity. So it begs the question as to what is in literature that is so difficult to replicate, or you miss it, or you destroy its quality when you try and be more scientific about it. So he called it the case of Sancho, is I think how he presented it to his students. And these are some of his observations, Berman. What characterized the analyses offered by these talented students? Most were written as case studies, the case of Sancho. The explicit statement in the text that Don Quixote represents an aspect of Sancho's personality was reformulated using psychological jargon. Various mechanisms were offered to explain the process described: projection, sublimation, denial, identification with the aggressor, rationalization, projective identification, displacement, repression, or its failure. Don Quixote was identified by many students as representing the id, but others saw him in the role of the superego, the object, the drive, or the shadow, which would be the Jungian version. So immediately you can see very few, if any. We'll see how many. I think he starts to unpack what number of students said what. But they immediately interpreted a piece of literature as something ripe for psychoanalytical analysis. So dramatic differences of opinion evolved regarding the patient's mental health. Some students saw him as a model of healthy integration who found the magic solution for handling inner conflict, whereas others doubted his sanity or even diagnosed him as psychotic or as a case of multiple personality. In comparison to this richness of dynamic and diagnostic formulations, only 3 out of 20 students used the word humour or irony in their responses. Most treated the text very sternly, and some relied on the title as proof of its truthfulness. Most students did not refer to the earlier connotations of the names used in the text. Only 3 answers referred to the way the text reverses the traditional images of Quixote and Sancho. So I think what he's pointing out there is they're very beholden to their training. That's the only way they can approach this little paragraph. But also very few of them had the literary knowledge to know what was being referred to through the terms Don Quixote and Sancho. So it's pretty good evidence. And this, I can't remember the precise date for when Berman, I think it might be late 80s, 90s. So this is about approximately 30 years ago. And it's only got worse, this idea that students aren't in touch with literature. And he's pointing out some of the consequences of that, what they're missing, the humour, the irony, the subtlety of the language, the nuances that are arguably unique to literature. Only 4 discuss literary characteristics of the text, its unique syntax, the different voices present in it, the contrasts, paradoxes, and turnabouts that startle and confuse the reader, its exploration of the creative process, the literary figure as an artifact and as an emotional reality, the parallels between the actual author of the text and its protagonist author, and their alliance in dismissing another author, in other words, Cervantes. So they just miss huge elements, which it begs the question, given that psychoanalysis is supposed to be such an insightful way of seeing the human condition, I think Berman is being very sensitive to the idea that yes, it can be. But why would you ignore an already incredibly powerful resource for understanding the human psyche? And in fact, psyche comes from the Greek goddess. The idea of the human psyche. So even the phrase is borrowed from Greek mythology. And then, I don't want to pursue this too much, because if I do a whole video on Don Quixote, maybe I could explore this. But Alonso Quijano is the actual disputed, but the real, inverted commas, the real name of Don Quixote in the book. He gives himself the name Don Quixote, but in the book he's actually a very low-level nobility. So that would be his, inverted commas, real name as a character. And he gives himself the persona of Don Quixote when he goes out on his adventures. So to add to the idea of who's the author of the text and who's it referring to, he also, I think it was one of the previous quotes, Berman's claiming that there's a unambiguous statement that Sancho Panza is using Don Quixote as an alter ego or as a mode of projection, when that's not even clear. It could be that Sancho Panza is allowing Alonso Quijano to use Don Quixote, and he's going along with that because otherwise Alonso Quijano as Don Quixote would take things out on him. So I'm not claiming that's true. I'm just saying that the level of ambiguity, I think there's a level that even Berman might have missed. And this issue of ambiguity in literature, it's not a case study. Ambiguity and a lack of clarity is baked in to the narrative form. And some people could see that as a disadvantage for trying to understand the human mentality. But I'm going to suggest all the way through that this lack of certainty, this ambiguity that's in literature, is actually its biggest resource and its biggest psychological truth. But we'll see how convinced you are. And any old excuse to show you I love Gustave Doré. I've used him to look at Dante's Inferno. I think it was the Art of Existential Psychotherapy video I did. But this was the annotation to the illustration that Doré did. A world of disorderly notions picked out of his books, crowded into his imagination. So it's the chaotic nature of his brain. And it's backed in Spanish, this similarity, locura, madness, and lectura, reading. So I said earlier that Don Quixote has this hyper-imaginative outlook. His brain is filled with this imaginative excess. Which begs the question, I'd suggest, of the notion of interior truth. And this is as early as St. Augustine, Confessions. The world will not supply an answer to those who question it. unless they also have the faculty to judge it. It would be nearer the truth to say it gives an answer to all, but it is only understood by those who compare the message it gives them through their senses with the truth that is in themselves. So as early as St. Augustine, this idea of interior truth. This is the interior truth people like Keith Raniere or Tony Robbins are claiming they can free up. So I think the question to be pursued is, what is the significance of this truth that's inside people, and to what extent can external people in the form of a self-help guru help you access it? Or to what extent are you totally in charge and totally responsible for your own engagement with your interior subjectivity? And this will surprise you, very fiercely of the point of view that any purported shortcut by a commercially driven self-help guru is not going to be as effective as you doing the work yourself. So then begs the question, well, what is that work and what does it look like? And I just think this is a beautiful representation of the act of reading. So locura, madness, and lectura, reading. That's the theme of Don Quixote, is to what extent is he mad? And to what extent does reading induce a form of imagination that, is it bad, is it good? The fact that fiction is such a strong facilitator of our imaginative interaction with the external world, I'd suggest is one of the key themes of Don Quixote. So Kierkegaard, adventures of faith. So a key aspect of Kierkegaard's theological and existential arguments is this concept of adventure, which I think fits neatly with the notion of Don Quixote going out on his adventures. So this is Meret talking about Kierkegaard. He sought that most philosophy is not even wisdom after the event, but only wisdom about wisdom, and little to do with any event. It's quite a nice way of putting it. The genuine critical dilemmas of the individual's life, and to Kierkegaard, individuals alone were real, are not solved by intellectual exploration of the facts, nor of the laws of thinking about them. Their resolutions emerge through conflicts and tumults in the soul, anxieties, agonies, perilous adventure of faith into unknown territories. So Kierkegaard was the person who popularised the concept of angst. I think in his native Danish it's angst, but in German it's angst. And often in English we use the phrase angst because anguish, anxiety doesn't really convey what angst is. It's more existential. It's more profound. But this idea of that's the only way. The critical dilemmas of the individual's life are not solved by the intellectual exploration of the facts, nor of the laws thinking about them. It's only through conflict and tumult in the soul, anxieties and perilous adventures, which again is what Don Quixote is all about. I particularly like, I don't know why, I really like this. It's the fluidity almost And I don't know what you think, but there's almost connotations or aspects of Edvard Munch, the way in which the figure of Don Quixote flows and the colour of the sky, everything's almost melting. And then another Gustave Doré. But the way in which Don Quixote, just the illustrations interact with the actual text, it's this notion that he's going out there in the world. He's confronting his anxiety and angst by engaging with the world on his own. Well, apart from Sancho Panza, of course. But it's not an intellectual pursuit. It's actual, the tumult, the conflict is what he seeks in his imaginative exploits. And what all of this, I'd suggest it's this notion of can't say it, unfathomable, unfathomable inwardness. So the reality of everyone's existence proceeds thus from the inwardness of man, not from anything that the mind can codify, for objectified knowledge is always at one or more removes from the truth. Truth, said Kierkegaard, is subjectivity. Now, to the extent Kierkegaard's saying truth is subjectivity, and cult leaders and self-help gurus are saying that you are the person who can control your life. So there's an emphasis on subjectivity by self-help gurus. But Kierkegaard is saying not from anything that the mind can codify or objectified knowledge. Whereas these self-help gurus and these cult leaders tend to have, well, Keith Raniere did, for example, files, 3-ring file binders of condensed down, I think he called them technologies, his modular way of representing the truth as he saw it in condensed formulae of his expressions or equations of how things work in the world according to him and how you can use them to manipulate your life. But this has happened to a lesser extent by Enlightenment Christian scientists and philosophers. I'm sorry, when I say Christian scientists, I mean scientists who happen to be Christian rather than the religion. So by analysing being into hierarchies of ideas and series of categories, they acted as the great secularizers of public thinking. They did, in a sense, objectify God as thought. What was omitted from this development of ideas was the real subject, man in the total, unfathomable inwardness of his being. So Kierkegaard, as an existential philosopher and theologian, whatever you want to call him, is defending the notion that there's an inwardness that literature and art can try to portray. And this is my point very early on, half in jest, this idea, but art will always fail. It can never fully portray this unfathomable inwardness. It's trying to, but it's the closest we'll ever get. It certainly won't happen from anything that the mind can codify through objectified knowledge. The real truth is in this very difficult to portray inwardness. And one, because remember, the two parts of Don Quixote are 1605 and 1615. And this is Velázquez Las Meninas, and this is from 1656, so about 50 years later. But this idea of inwardness, I have referred to this in a very early video on the channel, but again, if there's any enthusiasm, I think I could spend hours talking about this. But one aspect immediately to think about is the way in which the way everyone's looking at you, the viewer of the painting. You can almost viscerally feel the looks and your position where you must be for everyone to be looking at you like this. And Don Quixote is all about subjectivity, because it was about how Don Quixote, who read all these stories of chivalry, these knights errant, that type of literature was dying out. The fact that Cervantes was writing a novel that reflected upon how the world was changing and how chivalry was basically dying, and it dies along with Don Quixote at the very end of part 2. But this is part of the time. So again, part 2 of Don Quixote is 1615. This is 1656. But it's very clear from the time that the notion of subjectivity is being engaged with. Because we, the viewer of this picture, you're really, your position as the viewer, as an individual subject, is part of how the picture works. It's like that picture hardly makes sense unless you think of yourself as the viewer in front of that picture. And there's the added complication, a bit like the wheels within wheels of the novel Don Quixote. You can see in the background the mirror that implies Velázquez the painter is painting the royal couple who are reflected in the mirror. But if that's true, they're standing where we're standing as the viewer. So are we standing on the toes of the king and queen? And then you've got the guy in the background on the staircase in the open doorway, which I've got a theory about that too. But let's leave that for now. But all I wanted to show you was, of the time that Cervantes was writing, or 50 years later, what artists are very good at is capturing the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. And the spirit of the time was changing notions of what it is to be an individual and how you conceive that, the notion of inwardness. And I think it's reflected in this painting. But not just this painting, painting in general. So the famous idea of tilting at windmills. I would argue that the tilting at windmills is such an evocative image, and in one sense it's evoked brilliantly by Cervantes as part of a novel to question the role of imagination in our lives and our dreams and our fantasies and what's realistic and what isn't. But then if you took a photograph of someone dressed up like Don Quixote, and I think, wasn't it Terry Gilliam tried to do a film of Don Quixote, or someone similar, and it's just, I would suggest it's just impossible to film. It just doesn't make sense to try to film it. But it's interesting that a painting like this, an impressionist painting, because it's not a photograph, because it's not a film, actually does a really good job at conveying at least some element of the tilting at windmills idea. And again, at the notion of unfathomable inwardness. I really can't say that, can I? Unfathomable. I'll find a different way to say it. But again, this notion of Edvard Munch, that's what it reminds me of, at least. And then Sartre had the concept of uncertain freedom. So one aspect of self-help and the cult leader, the self-help guru, or at the extreme, the cult leader, is they have this certainty that they have the answer that they can provide you with if you study with them for long enough. And that's something I will never promise, because all I propose is more uncertainty, more confusion. But basically, there's a phrase in Sartre where he says we are condemned to freedom, which is a beautifully cheery idea. But he gives a very specific example, which I actually find quite helpful. He talks about it's during the Second World War, and he's a professor, and a student comes to him, and the scenario is his brother has died on the front fighting the Germans or he's died during the war fighting. It's 1940. The father of the family is a collaborator, and the mother is very close to this particular son, the student. And the student is torn. He has a dilemma that he asks Sartre about for his advice. Does the son go and join the resistance via Spain and end up in England, in London, to try and help fight against the Nazis? Or does he help his mother because he thinks without helping his mother, given the situation with the father and given that she's already lost one son, his mother will struggle to survive? So he's in the horns of a dilemma. And Sartre makes the point, there's no real way that he can get definitive advice off anyone in particular. So, for example, if he went to a Catholic priest, the priest might be a collaborator with the Vichy government, or the priest might be a pro-resistance. And even if he could get advice from one of those priests, so they're going to be biased depending upon their perspective from that point of view, but even from a purely religious point of view, there isn't anything within Catholicism or Christianity that could give him definitive guidance, because whatever he does, either his mother's going to suffer or he's not going to fight for the resistance, and the war effort will suffer. And he has to make this judgment. If he helps his mother, it's much more concrete. If he joins the resistance, he might not end up doing a particularly useful job. He could end up as a clerk, doing an admin job for the resistance, whereas he knows he can definitely help his mother. But then there's the guilt if he doesn't help fight the Germans. So there's no easy answer. And Sartre's point is that all you can do is follow your instincts. All you can do is make a choice and stick with it. It's like the early quote about you paint your own portrait of yourself. So if values are uncertain, if they are still too abstract to determine the particular concrete case under consideration, nothing remains but to trust in our instincts. In order to define the probable, one must possess the true. Before there can be any truth whatever, then, there must be an absolute truth, and there is such a truth which is simple, easily attained, and within the reach of everybody. It consists in one's immediate sense of self. So again, a bit like the self-help gurus, they're saying the answers lie within you, but as we'll find out, Sartre's not suggesting that's easily found. Your immediate sense of self isn't something that you can just dig inside and find immediately. It's more of a process. And you are the only person who can take responsibility for your own choices. But this almost existential quality, again, I'd suggest is very present in Don Quixote. It's through his adventures, his instinctive pursuit of adventure, that he tries to find himself. And I was mentioning Edvard Munch before again, the bands of colour and the way in which the horse's body flows into Don Quixote's legs. Which reminds me of him. So to develop this notion of uncertainty still, man is all the time outside of himself. It is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. And on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. Since man is thus self-surpassing and can grasp objects only in relation to his self-surpassing, he is himself the heart and centre of his transcendence. We remind man that there is no legislator but himself, that he himself, thus abandoned, must decide for himself. Also because we show that it is not by turning back upon himself, but always by seeking beyond himself an aim which is one of liberation or of some particular realization, that man can realize himself as truly human. So this tension I'm calling it the tension of transcendence, because Sartre's point is that our constitution of ourselves as individuals is based on this tension between looking inwardly, but also self-surpassing, seeking to transcend ourselves, which also paradoxically helps form ourselves. So you don't just stay as a static human being. It's this idea of actively painting your own portrait. But there's this constant tension between inwardness and transcendence. But it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. It is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself. These are all things that Don Quixote tries or does. Always seeking beyond himself. This idea of transcendence, the classic example is tilting at windmills. And it's just interesting, this is a coloured version, just from a purely visual point of view. I just much prefer the second one. It's like being at the opticians. Do you prefer, or is that better? Or is it better now? But if you ask me, I much prefer the Doré, the uncoloured black and white. But this idea of going on adventures to find yourself and the transcendence. I just love the way this is almost, the video I did on German expressionism, it's almost expressionistic. And I think thinking of this in conjunction with Don Quixote brings out more, both in the painting is obviously derives a lot of its theme from the book, but also the book, I think you get an extra element when you can engage with the art that addresses some of the issues from a completely different angle. And just another doorway of the idea of seeking transcendence. Now, you might have been wondering, since I very early on, seems a long time ago now, I named the idea of the Great Gatsby, but I think it relates to the concept of Don Quixote, this idea of desire and the imagination that's present in the Great Gatsby, and the concept of, well, I'll just quickly talk about the notion of desire. So if it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay, said Gatsby. He's talking to Daisy here. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. So in all the terms we've been talking so far, this notion of projection, the various ways to interpret the green light, and that would need to be done in a separate video on the Great Gatsby. But just this, it's a symbol. It's a projective symbol for Gatsby. And that's what enchants. His enchantment with Daisy is based upon this desire that has distance involved. Just like Don Quixote is going out into distant lands with this idea of chivalry that's quite distant from the here and now of the values of that time, because chivalry was, archaic even at that time. So there's this mismatch between reality and your projection, your desires, your fantasies, your imagination. And I'm arguing that it's present in The Great Gatsby in a way that is also present in Don Quixote. It's about this notion of enchantment and disenchantment. So Don Quixote sees the world in an enchanted way, and in this excerpt, so does Gatsby. This green light becomes his enchanted way of thinking about Daisy. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. So this theme of enchantment, which is all the way through Don Quixote until the very end, when he claims at the end he dies in a sane condition. He said he sees the foolishness of his previous imaginative exploits. And this idea of, there's an irony here. Daisy's right next to him, but it's almost that Gatsby's more interested in the experience of desire via seeing the green light at the end of the dock that he associates with her. So he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. He's more absorbed in what he just said than the fact that Daisy's next to him and she's just put his arm through his. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. So it's almost like he's lost the desire, now he's actually with her. When the green light was a symbol of distance and what he couldn't have but desired, it was immensely powerful. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. So it's quite a depressing novel. Even when he partially gets what he wants, it's by definition not what he wants, because he preferred the light at the end of the dock. But this is the depiction of Don Quixote's death. And it's an immensely complicated, or you could interpret it in a complicated way, the ending, because is Cervantes making fun of the stupid chivalry that Don Quixote pursued? The way he describes him dying, finally he's come to his senses just before he dies. Or is Cervantes describing the sad disenchantment of the world, where the enchantment of the chivalry that Don Quixote pursues, there's no longer a place for it? But interestingly, Cervantes is describing all this in a novel, which is the new form of how people engage with the concept of inwardness and interior subjectivity. So in the act of describing the death of chivalry in a fictional character, that fictional narration is considering all these complex philosophical ideas like Sartre and Kierkegaard, and the concept of enchantment, its importance in the human imagination. And again, from the Great Gatsby, this is towards the very beginning, when the narrator first sees Gatsby. I decided to call to him, but I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn that he was trembling. Involuntarily I glanced seaward, and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. So this green light. As the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island, here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. So I just see parallels here between the end of Don Quixote and the death of imagination, almost the symbolic death of an enchanted way of seeing the world. And Fitzgerald here is describing the first Dutch sailors who saw the area around Connecticut before it was developed. A transitory, enchanted moment. Face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. So the book is almost a weird panegyric to the loss. If you can, it's contradictory to set a panegyric to the loss of something. But it's an exploration of the loss of enchantment. The way Gatsby treats the green light, he's enchanted by it. But the novel as a whole is mostly about disenchantment, the shallowness of that society. But I just thought an interesting visual depiction of this description is the following. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Again, all about enchantment, the idea that I thought of Gatsby's wonder. His dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. And the poignancy, he did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city. And the eternal optimism of the idea that he believed in the green light, you keep chasing after it, but you're never going to get it. So I'll just finish with this. Michael Romer's Telling Stories is a brilliant book. He's a film professor, but I think he's actually a filmmaker. And the whole book is about the importance of narrative, in the sense that traditional narrative is quite dispiriting. The tragedies, the Greek myths, it's all about the lack of certainty human beings have. The only certainty they have is that they're going to die, and the gods are going to be capricious. But one of the aspects of that, the way he describes it, as you'll see as following. I think it's quite a powerful conclusion to his book. Today, most stories help us to live and die by distracting us from the sacred. But if we can face our situation, they may once again help us by serving as an encounter between the human and the sacred. If we can accept our uncertainty, even though we cannot trust it as we once trusted God, story may regain its credibility, and, by affirming rather than distracting us from necessity, recover its ancient, persuasive, and telling role. For what we call fiction embodies a reality we cannot afford to face in life, and what we call reality is in fact a fiction that allows us a measure of consciousness without casting us into despair. It may well be the reality and contradictions we can face only in fiction that give our lives meaning and shape. And in reference to both the Great Gatsby and Don Quixote, both Gatsby and Don Quixote get more meaning from their imaginative projection. The chivalry gives Don Quixote a reason to get out, and Gatsby's grasping for this green light. And I just think it's very powerful the way Romer inverts. For him, reality is almost a form of fiction, and fiction is a form of reality. For what we call fiction embodies a reality that we cannot afford to face in life, and what we call reality is in fact a fiction that allows us a measure of consciousness without casting us into despair. So Don Quixote really pursues, in his fictional chivalry, he goes deep into his inner nature. And he actually dies at the end when he comes to his senses and there's nothing much left for him. It may well be that the reality and contradictions we can face only in fiction that give our lives meaning and shape. So it's Gatsby's grasping after the green light that actually gave his life meaning and shape. And the actual prosaic reality of Daisy herself didn't really live up to it. I think I've depressed myself now. But I do think this is, I'd like to do more on Michael Romer. But this last sentiment, it may well be the reality and contradictions we can face only in fiction that give our lives meaning and shape. I was going to suggest, I think we could all raise a glass to that idea. So until the next time, all the very best.